Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.
عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش في ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجند العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عينيه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عينيه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقول هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقول هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع ايديا.
وسمعنا بيقول هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقول هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية،
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весь летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Oh
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I hope you enjoyed the half an hour of the musical interlude there, and we will be getting underway tonight in just a moment. But I will begin to just welcome everybody to the chat who's come in so far, and then we'll proceed to the business in hand. So, good morning to Banana Bender on the other end of the world, and Yuan, who says, from Arizona back from Jordan. Cobra Commander, who is also out in Arizona, and who says, MLs are completely outnumbered and outgunned here in Arizona. Well, we're outnumbered and outgunned everywhere at the moment. Not much we can do but basic education, trying to keep peace in my community. Apparently it's a militia territory and Karen factory. Doesn't sound particularly pleasant, but then again, late capitalism isn't pleasant pretty much anywhere. DE, good evening to you. Good evening to Peter, my fellow resident of perfidious Albion. Irish Partisan says, the Russian objective seems to be to degrade Ukraine's air defense system so that the Russian forces can go on the offensive. Certainly seems to be. Ukraine lost in 2014, says Cobra Commander. Well, Ukraine lost what was left, such as it was, of its sovereignty in 2014. The 10 years now since then has just been a process by which what was left of Ukraine was turned into more and more of a puppet state. Now it's just a pure puppet state. It can't exist without the assistance, such as it is, of imperialism. Lisa, who says, hi all, peace and goodwill. Seriously, well, peace and goodwill come through socialism. Good evening to Carmo, Moonis, Lee, Heidi, who says season's greetings from Edinburgh. Roddy. Apparently the tankies have taken over YouTube and live streams. Well, I would say there's been a certain increase in tanky YouTuber content, but most of the political YouTubers in Britain are still Labour Party people, liberals in all but name. Educating through memes? Well, sometimes. Good evening to Will. CRVS, good evening to you over there in Sweden. Hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby. Frank says, so is California. Empire succeeded in making Marxism untouchable. Well, hopefully we can undo some of the damage here on with regard to that. And that, of course, leads us to the business of the day. Now, I said a couple of days ago I was going to talk Marxism, an analysis of, or a Marxist analysis of addiction under capitalism and addiction as a part of a modern capitalist phenomenon that is an endless quest for transcendence. And by transcendence, I mean, of course, the old dictionary definition of it, which is to go beyond the range or limits of something. So to properly understand the addictive substances, shall we say, or the addictive way in which capitalism operates, you have to understand that we're living in a long hangover from missed revolutionary opportunities, which has led to all the manner of deviations and corrosions that you see before you. So, before we get into that, though, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to quickly advertise the stream and make sure everybody's aware that we are on. So, there's one. And I've just got to venture over to the wonderful world of Elon Musk's X. Make sure everybody knows that the live stream has begun. Okay, so we're good to go. So, when talking about like addiction, let's define our terms first of all. Now, I'm aware that the talk I'm about to give is going to be, by necessity, limited in its applicability by the examples from which I'm drawing. Now, the examples with regard to addictions and how people regard these and why behavior goes in certain ways. This is, of course, conditioned by my own material reality. How could it not be? Because I'm going to be using examples from my own life and the life of people who have been close to me at various different points. So one of the necessary things to understand, therefore, is that when I'm talking about here, I'm talking about various addictions that I've engaged in myself and I've known others to do. And these have all been from a position of not wealth necessarily, but a good degree more security than the bulk of the population has. See, I was never particularly, when I was working in the public sector, was never a particularly in a big earning job, but I did have a good deal more security than most of the population of Britain has in the form of job security, and was never without a roof over my head and never lost anything really through addictive behaviors. So that's the first thing to understand. And the second thing to understand is that when I'm talking about addiction, alienation, the substitution for God, that consumerism and addictive behaviors have stepped in for, I am, by necessity, referring again to the experiences of people who live in the imperial core, the experiences of people outside of the imperial core, particularly Britain being the oldest continually existing capitalist nation. As I've said before, there's an argument to say that the Republic of Venice was the earliest capitalist nation, or maybe the Dutch Republic ties with Britain in terms of being the oldest continually existing capitalist nation. But Britain being the oldest capitalist country that has existed continually in this roughly the same form as it has since its earliest time, being the first imperialist country, being still one of the premier imperialist powers, has manifested fully all the morbid symptoms of late capitalism and hyperalienation, along with, of course, the United States, which includes, of course, addiction and all the things that cause it. So my examples are conditioned by my own experience living in a late capitalist society. All the things that we're talking about revolve around alienation now. And so whereas my examples are, of course, limited by, again, my own experience, those who dwell outside of the imperial core nations, those in the oppressed countries, those in the countries that are subjected to imperialism's machinations, perhaps can't apply this in exactly the same way, as the condition of capitalism in their countries is going to be different. But I think there are some broader implications we can draw from the discussion we're going to be having tonight. So with that out of the way, a necessary disclaimer, I'm going to start off with our key reference here, which is the 1843 work by Karl Marx, and this is called, the title is A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. It's an unfinished, in some ways, excerpt from what was supposed to be a much larger work, but it does contain within it something which is absolutely crucial for our purposes here, which is to have a proper understanding of Marx's critique of religion. And in his early years, in 1843, it is some of his earlier writings. Of course, it is very much coloured by his response to Hegel. But I think that this, unlike many other idiots who make up the Western Academy, I do not see any great epistemic break between earlier and later Marx. The later Marx is a development on and an elaboration of the work of the early Marx. There's no great break. There's no libertarian early Marx and authoritarian later Marx. That's tripe made up by academics, hack academics at that. So let's then turn to the Marxist view of religion to anchor this discussion. I'm going to put the link to the document there, so you can follow along with it. It's fairly close to the beginning where we'll begin the quote I'll be reading from. It's a rather extensive quote, so be sure to keep your concentration. Quote reads as follows: "For Germany, the criticism of religion has been essentially completed, and a criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism. The profane existence of error is compromised as soon as its heavenly oratio pro aris e phosis, translation, speech for the altars and halves, i.e. forgotten country, has been refuted. Man, who was found only the reflection of himself in the fantastic reality of heaven, where he sought a superman, will no longer feel disposed to find the mere appearance of himself, the non-man, Unmensch, where he seeks and must seek his true reality. The foundation of irreligious criticism is: man makes religion, religion does not make man. Religion is indeed the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man, who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. But man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man. State, society. This state and this society produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world, because they are an inverted world. Religion is the general theory of this world, its encyclopedic compendium, its logic in popular form, its spiritual point d'honneur, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, and its universal basis of consolation and justification. It is the fantastic realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality. The struggle against religion is therefore indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion, as the illusory happiness of the people, is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is therefore in embryo the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Criticism has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order that man shall continue to bear that chain without fantasy or consolation, but so that he shall throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. The criticism of religion disillusions man, so that he will think, act, and fashion his reality like a man who has discarded his illusions and regained his senses, so that he will move around himself as his own true son. Religion is only the illusory sun which revolves around man as long as he does not revolve around himself. It is, therefore, the task of history, once the other world of truth has vanished, to establish the truth of this world. It is the immediate task of philosophy, which is in the service of history, to unmask self-estrangement in its unholy forms, once the holy form of human self-estrangement has been unmasked. Thus the criticism of heaven turns into the criticism of earth, the criticism of religion into the criticism of law, and the criticism of theology into the criticism of politics. Right. So that's quite an extensive quote, but I read all of it because I want to, first of all, give you an indication as to just how shallow the presentation of Marx's view on religion generally is. It's generally presented as just one line out of this, and the line is often misquoted. So when they say that Marx said religion is the opium of the people, that is, of course, barely even accurate as to what he's saying here. Now, I start with that when discussing how late capitalism promotes addiction, because what Marx is writing here in 1843 is about, of course, as he indicates, the criticism of religion. And he's saying essentially that in Germany, the criticism of religion has been completed. So like there has now been a critique of specifically the Christian religion, and that this is the basis upon which the criticism of German society goes ahead. Now, for Marx, of course, as he says quite clearly there, and as he will elaborate on at greater length in future works, the fate of religion is bound up with, of course, the struggle against, as he says there, the conditions which make religion a necessity. So that's the alienation of man from the fruits of his labor, that being one of them. Alienation being the primary driver of human beings back towards religion. Now, Marx is quite clear, and he says this in many different ways over the course of his life, that the abolition of religion, as he's quite clear about here, it can't just be abolished whilst keeping in place the conditions which push human beings back towards religious belief again, back because they are living in need of a soul in soulless conditions, to use a line from the quotation now. So the problem, though, is that in the modern period, as Marx says, the criticism of religion has essentially been completed. In the British case, the criticism of religion has been completed so well and so thoroughly in this country that official Christianity is all but dead. As barely anybody goes to Christian religious ceremonies or regular Sunday worship anymore. There are more who go in this country from second and first generation migrant communities. So there's sizable numbers of Christians from places like Nigeria, for instance, who pack out some churches in Manchester, Birmingham, London, etc. There's, of course, very strong religious belief in the particularly the Muslim areas of Britain, the areas of the country that are populated by migrants and the descendants of migrants from what was once British India, now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So you have very strong communities of Muslims, of course, of Sikhs and of Hindus. But given that this was a Christian nation at one stage, the fate of the Christian religion is to be almost completely extirpated. No one believes in it really anymore. Nobody believes in the official state church. It's a very old joke that nobody in the Church of England actually believes in God. So, given that we are the oldest capitalist country, the criticism of religion has been completed. Religion's place and hold on the imagination, even of the bourgeoisie itself, has gone. What's replaced it, though, of course, is nothing at all. So what we've done in this country, what's been done in the modern capitalist era, is exactly what Marx has said. The changes in capitalism has compelled people to abandon both official and unofficial Christianity. They've abandoned the illusions, but they haven't abandoned the chain. And so what you have is, in the place of religion, in the place of specifically Christianity, given that we are in a decaying imperialist power, a decaying period of late capitalism, this is part of the mixture we have to consider when analyzing how and why capitalism promotes various different addictions. And we'll come to that as to why in just a moment. But it is necessary to understand that much of what I'm going to be talking about when it comes to how addiction is all about an attempt to transcend the contradictions of capitalism by the individual, and is promoted as such by capitalism itself. A lot of this is dealing with the fact that we live in a post-religion society, or at the very least it's a post-Christian society, and therefore the bourgeoisie have encouraged, again, the shedding of the illusions that were required to make the chains of capitalism bearable, but the chains remain. And so what has happened, and you see conservative writers mourning about this as well, is that since the 50s, really, the official religion in Britain has been discredited even by the bourgeoisie themselves, whilst, of course, a yawning void opens up in people's inner life as alienation not only continues, but in fact gets worse. And as it gets worse, capital, in an attempt to overcome the antagonisms that it is creating, has sought to offer the individual a vision of a contradiction-free and a contradiction-free capitalism, a version of capitalism that can overcome the contradictions without the need for collective organization of the proletariat. And the way in which capitalism seeks to sell itself as a system through which the individual can not only thrive, but can even overcome the contradictions of capitalism itself and overcome the antagonisms of capitalism by continually reaching for and attaining, of course, a more perfect version of the self. So, whereas previously, at the time that Marx is writing that excerpt we've just been reading through, the poverty-stricken working class would have been told by their social betters that you must render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. You, the suffering masses, must labor in quiet and in a quiet and godly fashion, in order that you, as the meek and the wretched of the earth, will obtain a reward, of course, in the future. And if you work hard and sacrifice now, you will, of course, receive a reward in heaven. And, of course, this isn't something which is a particularly popular message. There are, of course, Christians, as the writers like E.P. Thompson point out, who vehemently dissent from this. But this message of quiet Christian sufferance through sacrifice is something which is preached by the bourgeois for a while, but it's something which doesn't really last. The bourgeois are obliged to respond to the growth of the power of the proletariat, and the preaching the old Christian gospel of quiet sufferance isn't something which is going to work. Now, how do we get to the point where the bourgeois themselves are positively promoting the idea of an endlessly perfectible self to the proletariat? Well, we get there via, of course, a fairly common reference point, which is, of course, the after effects of the Bolshevik Revolution, the deadly threat that this poses to the rule of the bourgeois, and their need to promote further divisions within the working class. And of course, they do this, at least in part, via the realization of the consumer revolution. And this has its roots prior to World War II. But in terms of consumerism becoming something which is accessible to the working class, this, of course, it accelerates after the 1950s. And it's a very important development for the ruling class, because what it does is it feeds into what I was just talking about. This idea that, well, you don't need to collectively organize with the rest of the class. And here we'll get to a famous quote from Thatcher in just a moment. You don't need to organize with anybody. You just need to work hard and rewards will come to you. And not only that, you can, via the vast expansion of and the availability of consumer goods, you can purchase your way not only to a better existence, but also you can purchase your way into living a version of the life of the bourgeois themselves. That is the promise of consumerism, that you, as a worker, can now find your way into at least a reflection of the life that the bourgeois lead. That is behind, of course, all the mass consumerism wave that follows the 1960s. The old ways of rigid class hierarchies, well, the class hierarchy became, of course, ever more rigid, but the bourgeois needed to talk about it in terms of flexibility, in terms of the maneuverability that the worker could enjoy if he or she worked simply hard enough. And this, of course, is something which is very much promoted into the 70s and in the 1980s. But what's promoted alongside of it? So that wave of consumerism is, I would argue, promoted in a way that is, of course, it is of course very profitable for capital to get the worker immediately spending their wages back on consumer goods again. But also, it's promoted in a way to secure, of course, an ever reliable customer base, because it becomes part of the phony self-actualization of capital. It becomes a source of fake transcendence. I remember that transcendence being to go beyond or to overcome something. And the consumer revolution in the West, particularly Britain and also the United States, it is all about, of course, telling the worker that he or she can overcome any class division via the purchasing of consumer durables or not very durables. So that is part of the propaganda system. It's a profit center, and it's also feeding what you could call addictive behaviors. You know, the purchase of commodities is meant to offer you a way to transcend your class position, at least for a while. And of course, that feeling that you get when you successfully purchase either a large or a small commodity is something that that is a feeling that is, of course, temporary, illusory, passing, and therefore, once it has passed, you need to refresh it again. But to turn to something which is connected to this, which is, of course, the subject of more direct addictions, more obvious addictions, which is, of course, narcotics specifically, but also alcohol, also sex and sexuality. All of these, of course, addictions to substances are as old as substances themselves, but nothing ever stays the same under different modes of production. So what you often find is that apologists for capitalism will say, well, people have always worked, there's always been a boss and there's always been a worker. But of course, the different relationships to the means of production change depending upon which economic mode of production we're in. You cannot compare the relationship between a slave and a master in Roman antiquity. Not really. to the relationship between the worker and the capitalist in the modern era. Other than that somebody's in charge and somebody's taking orders, the relationship is, of course, wildly different, as is the mode of production. So there's always been, indulgence on various different, shall we say, addictive substances. But how these are used and how these develop under different modes of production are, of course, wildly different. In the modern era, the narcotics revolution, shall we say, of course, we would be remiss if we did not mention the absolutely crucial role of British imperialism in the promotion of addiction across the world in the form of opium, which, of course, the British fought at least 2 wars over to secure their supply of opium and their ability to get millions of Chinese and Indians hooked on the shit. So we, as Britons, and you out there who are watching me in the United States right now, exist in the 2 of the biggest drug-dealing countries that ever bestrode the earth. So if we're looking at the narcotics revolution, the leaders of the narcotics revolution are, of course, British imperialism and US imperialism. So let's just start there and recognize that fact. The other point, though, is that the narcotics revolution dovetails with consumerism in a similar way, because what it does is it comes in and gets promoted by various bourgeois intellectuals in the 50s and 60s and 70s, whilst remaining nominally, well, illegal in a very real sense, given that the more poor you are, the more fucked you'll get from actually taking this stuff by the authorities. But it's promoted amongst the petty bourgeois and the so-called respectable end of the working class, i.e. the richer end, as, again, it's a form of transcendence. And this is something which, of course, many of us might have direct experience of. I certainly do. And the way it is promoted was, of course, back in the 1960s by the various sort of petty bourgeois intellectuals and sort of pseudo-radicals like the likes of Timothy Leary and people like that. It was specifically as almost a substitute religious experience. LSD, marijuana, other substances, specifically promoted as a way of, again, transcending the contradictions of everyday life. And to a certain extent, you can understand why this was an appealing prospect. Because, of course, it appeals to the inherent narcissism that grows inside all of us who grow up and reach maturity inside imperialism, inside the imperialist system. There is specifically though, I think since the 60s, capital specifically promotes a narrow form of narcissism and calls that freedom and self-expression. It's actually nothing of the kind. It's a promotion of the worst kind of self-indulgence and navel-gazing, which narcotics are specifically promoted as a way for you to reach a more true and authentic expression of yourself. So the way in which I remember drug taking and alcohol consumption being promoted to us as teenagers, specifically as teenage boys, was that this was something which, drink and drugs are going to be something which helps you to overcome your the drawbacks of yourself, the imperfections of the self, the parts of yourself that you don't like, the social awkwardness, an inability to relate to the opposite sex, perhaps, all of which could be overcome by the correct application of alcohol or narcotics. More broadly, or should we say deeply, in terms of the petty bourgeois intellectuals and their promotion of it, it becomes, as I said, an almost pseudo-religious enterprise. The idea that with a bit of chemical assistance, you can not only transcend, but you can, through that, you can overcome not only the elements within yourself which you dislike, but also the elements of the external world can be overcome, albeit temporarily. Of course, this doesn't leave you a great deal of. This doesn't give you a great deal of time transcending and escaping the internal drawbacks of your own self, or the contradictions that you exist within as somebody who lives in an advanced, or shall we say, decaying capitalist society. It gives you moments that are fleeting, and that you may reach one via drug consumption from time to time. I know I have from time to time. That and those moments are something which you internalize and you dwell upon and you seek to get back to, but of course you never can. And this is something which does very much feed addictions, because if you feel like you have reached some sort of transcendent moment, and you have overcome temporarily all the drawbacks you see in yourself, and also the impact that society, an inadequate society which you don't particularly like, even if you've not got the ability to properly analyze it yet, then you are going to want to repeat that feeling and find it again. And it's this quest for that transcendence that keeps you coming back to various different forms of narcotics and alcohol. Or even if you aren't taking or drinking any of those substances, there's other forms of temporary, illusory transcendence that you find as well. We have already mentioned the illusions of consumerist society that people indulge in and people get lost in, because they are finding a temporary transcendence there by being able to replicate on a small scale for themselves the lifestyle sold to them by the bourgeois. It's like seeing behind the curtain. This is why there's so many design shows on television. You're allowed a carefully curated glimpse into the fashion choices and the styles of the rich and famous, and told that you can purchase your way into it. And I've seen many people get as addled by that as they are by any substance, and certainly spend an awful lot on it. But it's another way of overcoming, or temporarily overcoming, the contradictions and antagonisms that you live within. And there's other things as well. For instance, how are motor vehicles sold to us? How is the car sold to us? Now, if, like me, you grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s as a teenager, particularly, again, like teenage boys, we were sold cars, and we wanted to get hold of cars because, essentially, and to be rather crude about it, it was a way of impressing the opposite sex. And this is certainly why I bought one as soon as was financially possible. And the other element about it is, of course, the way in which you can, again, via the usage of a car, you can, again, achieve a temporary escape. And the temporary escape, of course, comes through, in my case, indulgence in dangerous driving, indulgence in high-speed driving down very narrow country lanes, going as fast as you possibly can, going up to the point where you risk losing control of the vehicle, spinning off into a field and suffering some sort of horrific injury or death. But by doing that and getting away with it, and not, of course, ending up mangled and wrapped round a lamppost, it provides, as speaking personally, as big of a high as any drug or anything that you can drink can, because it is a way, again, it is a way of temporarily overcoming, temporarily transcending. You are, in those moments when you're risking your neck, going 80 odd miles an hour down a narrow road, pulling a very dramatic turn on tight corners and barely getting away with it. In those moments, you are, of course, feeling, you're not actually, but there is a feeling that you are freed from earthly concerns. And if you get it wrong, you're very much permanently freed from earthly concerns. And I knew a number of guys when I was younger who died pursuing exactly that. Now, of course, we didn't understand any of the things I've just outlined at the time as to why you wanted to do it, or why you kept going back to it, or why some men were happy to, well, not happy, but were happy to continually risk themselves and go to an early grave chasing this. But the high of getting away with essentially your own version of stunt driving is as dangerous as any other high you could possibly find, and it's pursued for the same reasons. Again, like, there is no church which you can go to overcome any of the feelings of massive alienation that hit you in this period of late capitalism. There's no traditional spiritual outlet that's available to us. Now, of course, there are those who indulge in, to quote the line from Spinal Tap, various bits of Eastern philosophies, and trying to combine them together to find some way of, again, overcoming alienation. And so Eastern religion in the 90s and the 2000s, Buddhism, corporate Buddhism in particular, became popular in certain circles. And if you move in certain bourgeois circles, even just for a little while, you can't avoid some tedious bourgeois bore banging onto you about how he discovered the Buddha whilst in a rebirthing ceremony in Yucatan or something. But again, though, the imperialist countries, other than, again, the religions of the minority communities, are spiritual deserts. There is still the need for a heart in a heartless world, but it comes through addictive behaviors. And the addictive behaviors become so because, of course, again, speaking from my own experiences, you're trying to find a way to make the temporary overcoming of the antagonisms in your life. You're seeking to find a way to make that permanent. You're seeking to find a way to make the transcendence permanent. Of course, you can't, because, again, it's an illusion. You're not freed from the material concerns of the world and your own material problems. You're not freed from alienation. There is a moment for perhaps 30 seconds, or if you're really lucky, perhaps a day, where you feel like you are. But then, of course, you come crashing back down to earth again. So this is the picture we find ourselves in. And, of course, consumerism is part of it, gaining a temporary escape that way. And also other things are. For instance, this is the reason why gender ideology has become popular. Again, it's a thing that's generated by extreme alienation and by people who are looking to, find a way of transcending the massive alienation that they face in their own existence. And their way of transcending this is to escape the self that they feel like that they have been given almost entirely by creating a new one. The internet also feeds these behaviors because, of course, you can go and create a whole new version of yourself purely online. It can be as different from you are as a rock is from a tree. But it's something which people now indulge in increasingly because, again, it is an escape. Why do they seek to create a wholly alternate reality? It is because, of course, that the actual material reality that they live in is so manifestly inadequate. Even if it's not, even if they're not starving to death or going through serious material deprivation, again, we go back to the point made by Marx, the heart of the heartless world. They're on, even if they're lucky, a corporate treadmill, a way of existence which feels unnatural, and so they of course naturally seek something which feels more real to them, or is just another version of unreality which is so wildly different that the thrill they get through indulging in it can take them out of themselves for an hour or a day. Same thing applies. The extreme alienation of modern day capitalism promotes all of these different behaviors. And whereas in earlier periods of capitalism, the church, the official church, would be there to deal with the alienation, to deal with the extreme reactions that capitalism creates within people. Now all of that's gone. You have it fracturing into, you have people fracturing their personalities more and more and more, with no reference or ability to make reference to any kind of spiritual world anymore, because that has long been discredited and gone in the form of the Christian churches. They're gone and they aren't coming back. So again, this addictive behaviors, the attempt to overcome your individual circumstances, the attempt to paper over the cracks and contradictions of your life, the attempt to overcome alienation, all of this is fueled by the late capitalist societies that we exist in. And I said at the beginning of this discussion that this was also, of course, because of the fact that we live in the long shadow of failed revolutions, which of course we do. This is, of course, reference to the fact that I and others have argued that really British capitalism ceased to be, of course, in any way progressive, arguably as early as the 1850s, when it went over the hump and was started to be beaten relentlessly by American capitalism. But certainly by the end of the 19th century, and of course the creation of imperialism, British capitalism ceased to play any progressive roles, wholly and completely reactionary. And you get into the later 20th century, and there are multiple occasions in which, under circumstances that would be different, with a better set of subjective factors in play, an actual revolutionary party in play, you could have seen the overthrow of British capitalism. But of course, unfortunately, for all the reasons that we go into quite a lot here, this is not happening. This didn't happen. Whereas, of course, what happened was, though, that whereas British capitalism might have survived, now we're simply in the long period of barbarism. It might not look like the barbarism that you associate with, the images in your mind that you associate with the term barbarism might not look like this. But there's no other way to describe a system which creates more and more extreme problems. In the case of Britain, more and more homelessness, drug addiction, early death, preventable deaths, deaths by despair. There's no other word for what capitalism has become in its rotting period in the United States, in Britain and elsewhere, other than barbarism. And it's a growing barbarism as well. And people's reaction to that is, of course, to naturally seek some shelter from it, be it real in the form of as much money as they can earn to try and shelter themselves from the worst of it, or in the case of an escape via various different forms of addiction. And that's the reality that we live in now. Because we live in barbarism, an increasing amount of barbarism, more and more people will seek an escape via various forms of addictive behavior. It doesn't have to be chemically assisted. It can be any number of things, as we've been going into. But when you have this long period, this long fallout from failed revolutions, and from a capitalism that is triumphant but dying at the same time, these are the morbid symptoms that Gramsci was talking about. The variety of morbid symptoms that appear are because the system is dying and nothing has yet grown up to the point where it can challenge it and engage people, the working class and even the middle class, in a collective struggle. Because to go back to what Marx was talking about again in our opening quotation, whereby you shed the illusion, but the chain is still there. And so the full and proper expression of the self, of course, can't come through capitalism. The full and proper expression of the self, once we've shed the religious delusion, can only come via the joining of the collective struggle of the proletariat. The full and proper expression of yourself as an individual is something that capitalism offers permanently. Remember what I said about capitalism offering these various forms of addictions as forms of transcendence to overcome its inherent limitations and contradictions. Well, this idea of an ever more perfected, ever more better realized version of you, a version of you that is available out there somewhere if you just buy the right thing, take the right drug, act the right way, create the correct online identity. That's the illusion that capitalism offers, that you yourself can be permanently revolutionized and you don't need to organize collectively. But of course they are trying to keep you away from the truth, which is that the only way to actually properly express your freedom as an individual is, of course, to realize the unrealized potential within the Enlightenment tradition itself, which is, of course, that the Enlightenment tradition in philosophy is one that is always imperfect, because it talked of the freedom of the individual, the rights of man, but of course was limited by the fact that it was applying to the bourgeoisie as the universal subject, not the proletariat. The proletariat are the class that can fully realize the promise of the Enlightenment via collective organization and struggle against capitalism, via the overthrowing of capitalism and the overcoming of the contradictions and antagonisms that capitalism creates by its removal, by the dispossession of the bourgeoisie, both economically and politically. And only through that struggle can the self be actually realized properly, shedding all of the illusions. Whereas what capitalism offers is the replacement of the illusions of religion with the ever-shifting illusion that you will find a true self somewhere if you just keep revolutionizing yourself under capitalism, which of course leads to all the addictive behaviors that we've been talking about. Because when you fail to realize this chimera, this ever-shifting illusion, when you fail to realize that, then the collapse into depression and the collapse into even greater forms of alienation, of course, intensifies even further. Right. So I've been talking for quite some time now, so I will pause now for comments from the chat. So, Banana Bender says, I think Millet is fast-tracking the end of capitalism. Could be that Millet is a deep cover agent, perhaps. It certainly seems like he's on a speed run, and we'll be returning to Millet in future episodes later in this week. Good evening to Morgan. James Graham says, I worked in addiction services voluntarily. Interesting. Good evening to Jerry. Hello to Klavek, who's been looking forward to the discussion. Good evening to Martin. Klavek says, religion is for those who fear hell. Spirituality is for those who've been there and didn't want to go back. Interesting. Lisa says, ayahuasca and DMT are gaining popularity. Yes, anything which clouds consciousness, essentially. Hello to Movie Maker Joe. Morgan says, a lot of drug use is escapism. Through personal experience, the personal experience has led me to conclude that there is a correct and healthy way to explore the use of certain psychedelics. Well, don't necessarily agree with that, but I can't speak to your individual experience, of course. I can only speak to my own. Morgan Comey asks, what is this stream? This is a stream about using Marxist-Leninist analysis to understand the world. Hope you can stay with us and enjoy it. Morgan says, what you just said about using substances to be a different version of yourself rings through. I used to think I was a better person under the influence of alcohol and stimulants. Sad to think of it now. Well, many of us thought that. I mean, that's the whole point I was making about the way, as early as being 14 or 15, I thought that the way to overcome the things that I didn't like about myself was to essentially get drunk to the point, or get fucked up to the point where what I regarded as the negative sides of myself would fall away. Of course, that was never the case. I was probably just more of a dick, but I didn't care about being a dick. So it's an unfortunate thing. But, of course, it is necessary for capitalism to promote such a thing because, again, it cannot give you the answers you require as to why there are certain things that aren't satisfactory in your own existence. With regard to my own particular story, what I regarded as my own inadequacies all stemmed from a completely false understanding of human relationships, and particularly relationships between men and women, which is, of course, a false understanding that many of us, both male and female, grow up with. And you're fortunate if you grow to the point where you overcome the false consciousness that is implanted within you at a very early age. You can spend a lifetime trying to get rid of the things that the combined effects of the culture industry and the advertising industry put in your mind and damage you from a very early period in your life. But this is why people end up taking drugs, going on like bizarre self-improvement plans, cooking up a bizarre stew of Eastern philosophy to try and meditate their way to a better version of themselves. It's why people read Sam Harris books, you know. It's not as damaging as heroin, but maybe it can make you behave in a worse way. So, the other thing I wanted to mention was, of course, the way in which this applies to particularly the late capitalist countries. Because, again, as I said, like the fact that we live in the long shadow of a missed revolution has made the situation for us much worse. In that capitalism cannot offer anything progressive now. It can't offer any real degree of economic growth anymore. It can't offer any degree of security as a result. It can only offer greater and greater insecurity. And so the only thing that the former reformists, the reformists without reforms, the Labour Party and the Social Democrats can offer now, really, was, until quite recently, the idea that your illusions and delusions can be validated officially by the state. That's one of the big struggle points, of course. This is why they all signed up to gender ideology. It's why they all signed up also to programs around so-called drug legalization, which are never fully going to happen because for all the dancing towards this, the Labour Party politicians and even some Tories do in this country from time to time, they're never going to make narcotics fully legal in this country because, first of all, that would undermine the power which the state has over the trade in the first place. But also because having narcotics be illegal is a great way of controlling people. It's a great way of criminalizing people. So periodically, though, the demand will come up for legalization. Some politicians will dance around it. There'll be some reclassification of cannabis or something. But they still want to keep those laws there. Why? Because, again, go back to something that Nixon said, or more to the point, John Ehrlichman said, that the war on drugs was a great way of busting up political rivals. And that was an open quotation from him several years ago. So the war on drugs, I mean, people like Peter Hitchens claim that the war on drugs was never fought. That will be news to anybody who knows anybody who's been inside after being caught with like relatively small amounts of narcotics. Now, truth is that along with every other kind of war that the capitalist state fights, it fights it on the basis of using the laws against those who are lower down in the social order. So against the working class and the lumpens, the full weight of the state is always thrown at them whenever the state feels the need to assert itself. Against the petty bourgeoisie, well, then the state is a little bit more selective in who it chooses to go after and who it doesn't. But against the working class, the law is always the law and the state is always an iron truncheon hitting you in the face, despite, from time to time, pretending to care about penal reform, about sentencing reform, about lessening the impact on people of sentences for possessing or purchasing relatively small amounts of narcotics. And the law is always a form of class war. And the so-called war on drugs is no exception to that. In fact, it very much proves the case. And so for writers like Hitchens and others who babble on about the fact that the war was never fought, well, it was. It was just fought on people who people like Hitchens think don't count. The likes of the British reactionaries would gain a visceral thrill if more petty bourgeois leftists of the celebrity variety went to prison. But of course, they don't seem to count all those people who ended up in jail for possessing a joint 20 years ago. Right. Ogham the Bald says, narcotics, Starmer deported someone for licking an ice cream. Starmer would deport anybody for anything. I mean, the idea that Keir Starmer, and this is a British-oriented thing, of course, is some sort of like closet socialist radical is like a truly absurd idea that like British reactionaries have been cooking up as a means by which they're going to try and scare like the conservative petty bourgeois out to vote for the Tories at the election, which will take place probably in May of next year. But it's such a joke if you know anything about Starmer's career. As I discussed in a recent interview I did with James A. Smith of the Popular Show, Starmer's entire career is based on using the full force of the state against workers in particular. That's Starmer's career. That's how he got to be the top prosecutor in the country. That's, of course, why he gets the job that he's going to get as Prime Minister, because he's a loyal and incredibly reactionary servant of the British state, which is, of course, why he was crucial to cooking up the scam job done on Julian Assange. But the Tories trying to sell Starmer as some dangerous leftist radical because he was a member of a Trotskyite group in university for about 2 years. But his entire career is of a deeply reactionary, very dangerous state functionary who will unleash a tidal wave of repression when he gets in, if he gets in, that will be worse than anything that the Tories have done over the previous 13 years. And that's been pretty bad. He will use all of the reactionary laws that the Tory government has passed with his support and add to them, because his mission is to smash the resistance of the working class by hook or by crook, with the added assistance, of course, of the trade union bureaucracy. So again, the idea that he's some sort of dangerous radical is a joke. It's a crude electioneering point done by the Conservative Party and their allies in the press. And it's not going to work either. Starmer will probably win. We can only hope that he wins in a way that does not give him as much power as the likes of Blair had. So the last thing we need is a Starmer government with a massive majority. A weak government with a small majority or no functioning majority will be far better. James Graham says, all the addicts I work with were under court orders. Yeah. The law hammers the poor, basically. The idea that anybody gets away with that drug addiction is something which he's gotten away with in this country or not punished by the system is a bit of a joke. Yuan says, activism to improve the material existence of others is the only way to free yourself from alienation. Not quite. I would say that the only way to free yourself from alienation is to engage fully in the revolutionary struggle. So, like activism, way you've described it there. But you might not have intended this in the way that you've worded it, but this is how it's come across. It's like engaging in good works to assist others, which can be a way of overcoming your own alienation. But the only way to truly overcome alienation now is to engage, is to educate yourself politically and engage however one can in the revolutionary struggle. This is why I say there's no shame in saying it's socialism or barbarism, because the barbarism's here now. There's no other way now to even start to overcome the massive alienation that you all feel, that we all feel, other than by engaging in a process of collective political education and starting organizing towards revolutionary action. That's the only way. There's no other way around this. There's no 10-step program. I suppose you could, of course, find solace in the taking up of old religion, which many people are doing. But this is not the answer. There's no answer in the Catholic Church. There's no answer in the Protestant Church either, or Judaism or Islam or anywhere else. People have found in, particularly Islam these days, a way of actually imposing some form of discipline on themselves, particularly for those who are struggling with addiction issues or who have been in prison. They find the adoption of a more conservative form of Islam to be something which helps them reorder their lives. And I'm not going to question that. If somebody's found that particularly useful, I'm not going to say whether that I'm going to tell them that's a bad thing. But in my view, the key to enlightenment, the key to the overcoming of alienation is partly through obtaining enlightenment via the collective process of political education and then joining a revolutionary struggle however one can. This is the only way forward now. There's no way of building a life which is going to be immune from the uninterrupted downward spiral that British and American capitalism is locked into. There's no way out anymore. People think, and I've had this conversation with people, they might agree with me on many different points, but they say, well, they reflect that thing, that phrase of Thatcher's. If you remember this, Thatcher said, and the full quote I will give you is that there is no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. And the last half of that quote is routinely left off. And that's the worldview of the sort of Thatcher-Reagan period. And what does it mean? Well, it means that essentially it is a call for the death of class solidarity. What it tells you is that the only thing that you can possibly control is your own life. You can have control over your own life via working hard and obeying the rules. And if you do that, then, to paraphrase Ben Shapiro, then you will be able to have a family. And if you keep working hard, you can have the 2 or 3 children. And you as an individual in your family, that's what you can control. That's what you can look after. And you shouldn't worry about anything else other than that, because you can't control anything else other than that. And that is your way to a meaningful existence. And of course, that is meant to be, and this is why the phrase was come up with. I don't know who came up with it. It wasn't Thatcher herself. It might have been Tim Bell, one of her speechwriters. I'm not sure. But it's designed to be the death of working class solidarity. I'm all right, Jack, I've got mine, well, fuck you, And so the idea that it puts across is that you can maybe not change anything in the wider world, but you can always change yourself. Just work a bit harder and raise a family and keep your nose clean and and when you close the door behind you in the evening, the evils of the wider world will not cross your doorstep, and you should shoot them if they do. So this is the incredibly narrow-minded and ultimately self-defeating phrase, one of the phrases that defines like the post-1980s era. Because ultimately you cannot immunize yourself from the wider concerns of your class, no matter how much of the hyper alienated culture that you imbibe, no matter how much you think of yourself as being cut off from the wider working class, you are still linked to it by 1,000 strands, and you cannot escape the fate of your class, no matter how much you sell out, no matter how much you take a giant dump on other members of your class, no matter how much you scab, you still can't escape the wider reality. And so you'd better embrace it. And you better embrace it in a way that leads you to become educated about the way in which you cannot escape the class structure of society via trying to become more of an individualist. The only way you are going to secure a better future for yourself and any children you may have or wish to have in the future is by overcoming this hyper-alienated society, which means overcoming capitalism itself, the overthrow of the ruling class, the dispossession of the ruling class, economically and politically, socially and culturally, and the institution of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Only through the exercise of that collective dictatorship can the proletarian just start to overcome his or her alienation. Only through the realization of this collective project to truly exercise control over our lives can we start to overcome alienation. Not through various addictions, not through buying things, and not through closing the door firmly in the face of the rest of our class, as Margaret Thatcher told us to. Right. Hope that clarified things somewhat. So, hello to Dan Kovalik, who's enjoying the show. Well, glad you are, comrade. Good to see you here. So, that brings me to the conclusion of what I wanted to talk about tonight. I hope that you've found this to be an interesting and illuminating discussion. I'm happy to return to it if there's an enthusiasm to do so. Until next time, though, I will bid you farewell, and we will be back with you again tomorrow night, returning to the question of the Russia-NATO war in Ukraine and the latest developments there. Thank you for tuning in, everybody, and I'll return you to your musical interlude.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles.